Welcome to our very last video. And this one is about notification. So now we've made it all the way through our investigations. We've figured out whether the laws apply, and we have determined that we have a duty to notify under data breach notification law. So what does that mean? Who exactly do these laws require that we notify? Typically, it's going to be almost always, it's going to be the impacted individuals. Um, it's going to be the government entities. The one time it might not be the impacted individuals and only the government entities would be in Canada or in Europe. In the US, we're also going to have an obligation potentially to notify credit reporting agencies. And then there's going to be some other notification obligations. Some of them may occur earlier, like a duty to notify a data owner if we're a vendor, if we're managing the data on behalf of our client, or there might be some contractual obligations that are triggered before the law itself. So what does notification look like? First, for providing notification for individuals, the laws require specific methods of notification. The notification would either be written, email, sometimes phone, that's fairly rare, or substitute notice, which I'll talk about in a second. The content of notice is going to vary by jurisdiction. Whether we have specific content required is discussed in more detail in chapter 6, 7, and I'd suggest you take a look at that. Substitute notice is going to be required if notice itself is too costly, if we don't have information about the person, or if there's too many people impacted. Sometimes we worry about, do we have to give substitute notice? Or do we want to give substitute notice? Because for substitute notice, that usually means that we're putting something on our website, we're taking out an ad in a newspaper, or we're doing a press release to let newspapers know. And we might be sending an email if we have email addresses, but not physical addresses. So substitute notice is not something that we're always going to want to do. So we're not going to presume that substitute notice is a great thing. So notifying government entities. This is why we spend so much time figuring out whether laws are triggered and which breach notification laws are triggered, because we want to know, back on the providing notice to impacted individuals, we need to know what content to include in the notice, and so that's going to be determined based on the state laws that are triggered. So but we're also going to need to notify government entities in specific states based on which state laws require it. So we might notify individuals across the country, but because we've triggered just say one state's notification law, but we won't notify necessarily a state whose law wasn't triggered, this government authority. So we'll notify individuals in that particular state, but we won't necessarily notify the individuals, the government authority in that state. Sometimes we might, but often we do not. So it's very important as our first step to figure out which government authorities we need to notify. And to do that, we're going to look at what state laws have been triggered, the location of the impacted individuals, and whether or not the state laws were triggered. So did our fact pattern include personal information as defined by those state laws? And was our fact pattern a breach as defined by those state laws? Then we'll look at the specific notice requirements for those government authorities. Which government authorities? Is it the Attorney General? Is it the Bureau of Consumer Affairs? It's going to be a different entity or agency. Sometimes they change. Then what is the timing? Do we have to notify before we notify impacted individuals, at the same time we notify impacted individuals, or perhaps after we notify impacted individuals? Is there specific content that we have to include in our notice to government authorities? Perhaps we have to give a sample of the notice that we provided to impacted individuals. Perhaps we have to provide names of the impacted individuals. And then finally, what is the format? Does the state want to receive it by web form, by fax, by letter? What is the format? They might also have a specific online form. In those web formats, there's often more information that's requested that a company provide than is required under the breach notice laws. So it's important at the beginning to be thinking about that during the investigation so we know what facts we're going to need to gather and we don't scramble at the end. And then finally, and this is throughout chapter 6, and there's some specific subsections in there, but being prepared and thinking about the follow-up questions that are going to be asked, both by individuals but also the government authorities. How did this happen? Was the company the cause of the breach? What steps has the company taken to remediate? So that's requirements with respect to government entities. Very briefly, there are requirements about credit reporting agencies. So these are the entities, there's 3 of them, TransUnion, Equifax, and Experian, that tell us whether or not we have good credit, bad credit. And so if a bad actor is opening a bunch of bank accounts or credit card numbers in our name, that's going to be reflected in our credit report. And also by reporting the breach to the credit reporting authorities, they can arguably be on the lookout to make sure that there isn't something strange going on with someone's credit. Many jurisdictions that require notification to credit reporting agencies have thresholds, number of impacted people. So that's usually the least difficult part about notice. The real tricky part is the notice to impacted individuals and the notice to government authorities. Because these requirements change all the time, this is why we only spend 1 class on it and we don't get too in depth, because you can feel very confident that by the time you need to deal with this in real life, the requirements will have changed. So you can go back, you can think about the sections in the book, you can think about what the requirements are, but think more about the process and the different things we need to worry about and less about having charts where you can say, okay, I've charted out all of these different states and I know exactly where they fall, and more about your different columns and what are the different questions to ask so that at the time you really need to deal with it, you can go back in and update it right then in the moment. And that's the way we do it. So finally, vendors. So third parties that are maintaining information on behalf of data owners. So this is something that I had mentioned, we have mentioned throughout the class, this idea that we've got the who owns versus maintains the information. So for those that are maintaining the information, they are going to be required to notify the data owner under most state laws. It's also going to be built into most contracts these days. And when you're looking at the contracts, we want to be thoughtful because often the contract will have a lower threshold than the law itself. So the law might say you have a duty to notify if there's been unauthorized access or acquisition, but the contract's going to require if you suspect unauthorized acquisition or access. The law might say if only these types of personal information are impacted. The contract might say you've got to tell us no matter what kind of personal information is impacted. So there's going to be a little bit of a variance between those two things. The state laws, these are the bottom 3 here. The state laws are often going to have timing requirements when you tell the data owner, duties to cooperate with the data owner in its investigation. And in rare circumstances, there may be a duty for the vendor to notify the individual directly, but typically that does not happen, and the contract is going to contemplate that it's the data owner that does the notification and not the vendor. So I apologize, I forgot our fun little last slide that says see you in class, but hopefully this video was helpful and I will see you in class.